Everybody's here. We're ready. Let's get going. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Richard Drax.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Will the Prime Minister agree with me that it is totally unacceptable for members or prospective members of this House to say anything which supports terrorism?
Well, I absolutely agree with what my honourable friend has said, and I think, frankly, it is absolutely staggering that there is someone standing for public office who has said this. In October 1984, when the Brighton bomb went off, I felt a surge of excitement at the nearness of Margaret Thatcher's demise, and yet a disappointment that such a chance had been missed. Those are the words of the Labour candidate in the Eastleigh by-election. They are a complete disgrace, and I hope the leader of the Labour Party will get up and condemn them right now.
Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, 3 years ago, the Prime Minister had this to say: the first priority of any government has got to be keeping UK PLC's credit rating. That's got to come first. It's the only responsible thing to do. Can the Prime Minister tell us how's that going?
First of all, isn't it amazing that the Leader of the Opposition won't condemn someone who apparently speaks up for terrorists? Isn't that absolutely disgraceful? Well, he'll have a second chance when he gets up again. Look, the decision of the ratings agency is a reminder of the debt and the deficit problem that this country faces, and frankly, it is a warning to anyone who thinks we can walk away from it. It is absolutely vital that we continue with the work of this government that has cut the deficit by a quarter, that has 1 million extra private sector jobs, and has interest rates at record low levels. And I note that it's still his policy to address excessive borrowing by borrowing more.
Mr. Speaker, I was asking about the country's credit rating, the country's credit rating. And this is what he used to say about our credit rating: that it was a mark of trust in our economy, that it was right up front and centre in our new economic model. And his manifesto that he published at the general election said this: safeguarding Britain's credit rating was the very first of his, and I quote, benchmarks for Britain against which the British people can judge the economic success or failure of the next government. So does the Prime Minister accept that by the first test he set himself, he has failed?
If there is a problem of excessive borrowing, why is it his policy to borrow more? That is the question he simply has to answer. If he wants to listen to the credit rating agency, Moody's say this: Moody's could also downgrade the UK's government debt rating further in the event of reduced political commitment to fiscal consolidation. Now, on this side of the House, we know that is the vital work we have to do. Will he finally now admit that he's in favour of more borrowing? Admit it.
Speaker, you always know when he starts asking me questions that he can't answer questions about his own record. The part-time Chancellor said it would be a humiliation for Britain to lose its AAA credit rating. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is not big on humility, but his manifesto did promise he'd be accountable and open. So let's give him another go. Simple question: yes or no? Hasn't he failed the first economic test that he set out in this manifesto?
Look, I'm not arguing for one moment that the rating agency doesn't matter. That is his argument. Yes. His argument is the rating agency doesn't matter. The answer to debt is to borrow more and not to take any responsibility for the mess they left. It is this government that's cut the deficit by a quarter, that has 1 million private sector extra jobs, and has low interest rates which are vital for the future of this economy. And if he wants to see those economies that maintain their AAA rating, they're countries like Canada and Germany that fixed the roof when the sun was shining. But let me ask him again, why doesn't he admit his answer to extra borrowing is to borrow more? Have another go, admit it.
Any time he wants to swap places, I'll happily answer the questions, Mr. Speaker. And he talks about borrowing. I don't know when the last time he checked was. The deficit is rising, not falling this year. And he's borrowing £212 billion more than he planned because of his failure to grow the economy. Now, let's turn to the reasons for the downgrade. Can we take it from his answers so far that he really believes that this loss of the country's AAA status, which he set as the test, has nothing to do with him?
I'm the one saying this credit rating does matter, and it demonstrates we have to go further and faster on reducing the deficit. But the very fact he won't answer the question about wanting to borrow more, he will never sit on this side of the House when he won't answer the questions about what the country needs to know. Now, if he wants to look at what's happening in our economy, isn't it interesting that he doesn't mention the other economic news from last week, which is 154,000 extra people in work, more people in employment than any time in our history, youth unemployment down since the election, unemployment down since the election. That is what is happening in our economy, but he can't recognise it. When is he going to admit that we should never listen to someone who sold the gold, who bust the banks, who racked up the deficit and can't say sorry for any of it?
I think we can take it from that answer, Mr. Speaker, that he can't accept the simple fact that he has failed on the first test he set himself, and it's his fault. It's happened on his watch, Mr. Speaker. And borrowing is rising under him. Even after all the pain of the tax rises, all the spending cuts, borrowing is rising because the part-time Chancellor's plan is failing, Mr. Speaker. And the truth is that they are the last people left who think their plan is working and the failure is nothing to do with them. We've got 1 million young people. Oh, the Education Secretary calls that that's not true. Maybe he believes it too. But behind the scenes, he's briefing against the Chancellor, Mr. Speaker. We've got, maybe they should swap places. We've got 1 million young people out of work. The deficit is rising, not falling. The economy is flatlining. What further evidence does he need that his plan just isn't working?
Well, let's just examine the points he's just made. He says the deficit is up. The deficit is down by a quarter since the election. He says that we don't have support for our plan. The CBI, the biggest business organisation in the country, says we have the right plan for growth. He complains about the level of unemployment. It is down on the election, and we have a record number of people in work. Those are the facts. Now let us look at his policy. Let's examine the fact that the New Statesman, the in-house magazine of the Labour Party, says this. His critique of the government's strategy will never win back public trust. His proposals for the economy will never convince. His credibility problem will only become magnified as the general election approaches. That's not Conservative Central Office, that's the New Statesman.
Miliband.
Greatest of respect to the New Statesman, he's scraping the barrel, really, by quoting the New Statesman. All we've heard today.
Order, Mr. Zahawi, you are an excitable fellow. It's not very statesmanlike. Calm yourself. You'll get better over time. Mr. Ed Miliband.
All we've heard today is a Prime Minister who refuses to accept that he's failed on the central test he set himself. He's failed to meet the first test he set for himself. It's not just our credit rating that's been downgraded. We've got a downgraded government, a downgraded Chancellor, and a downgraded Prime Minister.
He says that the New Statesman is scraping the barrel. It was the only newspaper that endorsed his leadership. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, in this Oscar week, perhaps the best we can say is this. Daniel Day-Lewis was utterly convincing as Abraham Lincoln, and the Right Honourable Gentleman is utterly convincing as Gordon Brown. More borrowing, more spending, more debt.
Andrew Jones.
Mr. Speaker,
In their 10 years running Harrogate Borough Council, the Conservatives have cleared the £19.6 million of debt left by the Liberal Democrats, and in doing so delivered a 4-year council tax freeze. Does the Prime Minister agree that this shows the wisdom of tackling debt, and that any urges to borrow more, as the party opposite, is the road to ruin?
No, I think my honourable friend makes an important point, and it is worth recognising that when it comes to finding efficiencies and finding value for money, local government has an excellent record, and we should really say that in this place, that they have a good record of paying down debt, dealing with deficits and being efficient. And of course one of the benefits is that reduces your debt interest charges, and that's something we have to focus on in this government, in this country.
Albert Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next month, a big event alongside the budget will be the Champions Wales playing England at the Millennium Stadium. Does the Prime Minister have the same confidence in England winning the Triple Crown as his Chancellor had in retaining the credit rating at AAA? And as team manager, does he intend to change his economic team to avoid further humiliation and a triple-dip recession?
Well, there's a difficult record with Prime Ministers endorsing various rugby or football teams, so I won't plan to do that here. All I'd say is I'm very proud of the fact that on St David's Day, the Welsh flag will be flying above Downing Street, as it should be, and when it comes to the rugby, may the best team win.
Sir Peter Tapsell.
Has my right honourable friend noticed that since we, in common with the United States and Japan, lost our AAA status, the cost of our international borrowing has actually fallen?
My right honourable friend makes an important point, which is while I don't deny for 1 second the importance of the ratings agencies, the most important test of credibility, which is a test you face day in, day out in the markets, is the rate of interest at which you borrow. And the rate of interest at which we borrow is still at record lows. It has gone down since the election, where it has gone up in many other countries. And if we listen to the party opposite, it would go up again.
Mr. Gordon Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware of the increased need for food banks in constituencies such as mine, brought about by his government's failed policies. Will he sign my petition calling for action so that no family in the UK goes hungry due to his policies?
Well, I'll certainly look at the honourable gentleman's petition. The point I'd make is, first of all, the use of food banks went up tenfold under the last Labour government. But a very important change we made, asked for by the Trussell Trust, which does so much to promote the work of food banks, was to allow them to be advertised in job centres. Now, the last government didn't do that because they were worried about the PR. Well, we put people ahead of public relations.
Graham Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the generation that fought in the Arctic convoys and Bomber Command, who died in the Second World War, finally been recognised. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that it's right and proper we should remember the 3,000 sailors and the 55,000 members of Bomber Command who gave their lives for this country's freedom?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this issue, and I'm sure there'll be support right across the House of Commons for all those who took part in the Arctic convoys and all those who served in Bomber Command. And it's not enough to have that excellent memorial to those who served in Bomber Command in Green Park. It's right that we have the Medal for Arctic Convoy and the Class 4 Bomber Command. One thing I've been stressing to colleagues in government is it's very important we get on and hand out these medals and these clasps as quickly as possible, because people who served all those years ago, tragically, we are losing more and more of them, and they deserve their medals, they deserve their clasps, and I'm proud that under this government they'll get them.
David.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin live in the Caerphilly borough. They are both registered blind and they rely heavily on their guide dogs, family and their neighbours. Life isn't easy for them. But on the 1st of April, things will become even more difficult because Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin will have to pay the government's bedroom tax on their home for 26 years. What justification can there be for this?
Well, first of all, I will look at any individual case, and the Department of Work and Pensions will look at any individual case. But can I just first of all make this point? This is not a tax. A tax is when someone earns money, it is their money, and the government takes some of it away. And frankly, the party opposite have got to engage in the fact that housing benefit now accounts for £23 billion of government spending. That is a 50% increase over the last decade. And we have to address the fact as well that we have 250,000 families in overcrowded accommodation, and we have 1.8 million people waiting for a council house. And that is why it's not surprising the honourable gentleman on the front bench is shouting shameful. Let him listen to what Labour's housing minister said under the last government. He said this: "We have reiterated time and again the need to ensure that houses that are too large for people's current needs are allocated accordingly." That is what they said in government. Now they're in opposition. All we get is rank opportunism and irresponsibility.
Smith. Unemployment in Yorkshire is down at its lowest level in 2 years. Businesses in Yorkshire have got full order books, and the head of the CBI has said that the Yorkshire economy is turning a corner. Would he ignore the poor advice from the party opposite?
Well, I'm grateful for what my honourable friend says. Look, the British economy has been through difficult times, not least because we are recovering from a massive boom and bust, a massive banking bust, and the deepest recession since the 1930s. But if you look at what is happening in terms of employment, in terms of new business creation, you can see an economy that is rebalancing. And it's that rebalancing and that business growth that we need to encourage.
Hazel Blairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has stood idly by whilst hard-pressed families in Salford and Eccles and across the country have faced soaring energy bills, now over £1,400 a year. Last October, the Prime Minister promised to take action. I think the whole country now wants to know, what is he going to do now to keep his promise to those families who are struggling to heat their homes?
We are legislating to make sure that energy companies put people onto the lowest tariffs. When that bill comes in front of the House of Commons, I hope she'll vote for it.
Mr. Adrian Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister withdraw the National Health Service procurement, patient choice and competition regulations that seem to contradict assurances given in the other place that this coalition government will not privatise our NHS?
No, I would urge my honourable friend to look very closely at these regulations, because I think what he'll find is they are absolutely in line with the principles the last government put in place, and actually the effect of withdrawing the regulations would actually mean that you have more competition in the NHS rather than managed competition managed by Monitor. So I think the effect of what he wants could be the exact opposite of what he seeks.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Energy Secretary, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Committee on Climate Change, the Chair of the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee, and a group of over 35 businesses, NGOs and faith groups are among those in this country who back the inclusion of a target to decarbonise the power sector by 2030 in the energy bill. Can the Prime Minister explain why his government have failed to include such a target in the bill?
Well, we don't believe it makes sense to consider setting a target range for 2030 in advance of setting the fifth carbon budget, which of course covers the period 2028 to 2032. So we'll be taking the power in the energy bill, but I think setting it in advance, as I've just explained, wouldn't make sense.
Charlotte Leslie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2008, Labour commissioned 3 reports into the state of the NHS to celebrate its 60th birthday party. We now know those reports were damning and raised issues such as a dangerous target culture that was raised by Francis 5 years later. We also know those reports were suppressed by the Labour government.
Shocking.
Had they not been suppressed, thousands of lives could possibly have been saved.
Yeah.
Will the Prime Minister join me in calling for an investigation
Your what, Ed?
as to who exactly was responsible for suppressing those reports?
Well, I know what my honourable friend has said, and I will look carefully at the issue that she raises. I think the whole point about the Francis report is we should use this opportunity to say, yes, of course we support the NHS and its founding principles, but not everything in the NHS is right. And where there is bad practice and where there are things going wrong, we need to shine a very bright light at that and make sure not only that we deal with it, but we also hold people to account for it as well.
The Abrahams.
Further to the honourable member's question on the new regulations laid down on the 13th of February, the government gave categoric assurances that GP commissioners would not be forced to put health services out to competitive tendering. The regulations go completely against this. What is the Prime Minister's excuse for this?
The GP commissioners are not forced to put services out to competitive tender. It is GP commissioners, and the point is it is going to be doctors making the decisions about whether they want to expand choice and diversity in the NHS. But I would say to the honourable lady, what is she worried about? What is the Labour Party worried about? Isn't it the case that there are lots of voluntary bodies, charities, the hospice movement, organisations like Mind, organisations like Whiz Kids in Tower Hamlets that provide an amazing service for children with wheelchairs? What are we frightened of allowing doctors to say, let us have some diversity, let us have some choice, let us make sure we're on the side of patients?
Mr. Alan Cairns.
2.5 years ago, 9-year-old Cerys Potter from the Vale of Glamorgan became the 9th person to die in a river incident on a rafting exercise on the Dalman River. There appeared to be blatant disregard to common sense health and safety standards. Cerys's parents have campaigned tirelessly for a criminal investigation, improved standards, and even funded witnesses to travel to the Turkish courts, but their efforts have been frustrated for what appears to be bureaucratic reasons. Will the Prime Minister work with the Turkish authorities to gain justice and help warn people of the risks of whitewater rafting in Turkey?
No, well, my honourable friend is quite right to raise this tragic case of a 9-year-old constituent of his, Cerys Potter, who died in 2010 in Turkey. I want to send my sincere condolences to the family in these terrible circumstances. I know that he has been speaking to the Minister for Europe regarding this case. I know that our embassy in Turkey is monitoring the case and can again approach the Turkish authorities and ask them to keep the Potter family fully informed of any progress, and I'm sure the Foreign Office will have listened very carefully to what he said today, standing up for this family's interests.
Catherine McKinnell.
I have a vulnerable constituent near pension age who has lived in the same house his whole life. His parents have now died and he is willing to be rehoused but cannot find an alternative. He now faces homelessness because he simply can't afford the government's bedroom tax. Can the Prime Minister explain why he has prioritised a tax cut for millionaires whilst devastating the lives of vulnerable people?
The point I would make to the honourable lady is there are 250,000 families who live in overcrowded accommodation. There are 386,000 people who live in under-occupied homes. There are 1.8 million people who would love to have a council house who can't get one. Now, of course, we need to build more social homes, and we're doing exactly that. But in the meantime, we should do everything we can to make sure those homes are used in the most efficient and fair way. That is what these changes will help to achieve, and that is why they deserve our support.
Mr. Greg Mulholland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We were all hugely inspired by the wonderful Paralympic Games in London last year. Not only a triumph for sport, but also a triumph for perceptions of disability. Will the Prime Minister welcome the generation-inspired report, which is going to be presented to Downing Street by Hannah Cockcroft MBE today, as a great opportunity to use the legacy of this to improve the lives of young disabled people?
Well, I would certainly welcome the report that my honourable friend mentions. I thought that the Paralympic Games were an absolute triumph for Britain, the way they were put on, and also the way that the auditoria, the stadia were full for almost every single event. I thought it was a great testament to the generosity of people of this country and their enthusiasm for Paralympic sport. But I think the most important thing is the change in perception about what disabled people are capable of, and I think that is a real gift and something we should encourage.
Doyle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister supports an exemption to the bedroom tax for the families of prisoners, but not
for people with cancer, people with disabilities, foster parents or for armed forces families. Why?
As the Honourable Lady knows, first of all, there is a £50 million fund to directly support people as part of this measure. We've addressed very specifically the point about armed forces families, where people leaving the home will actually be more than compensated for any costs under occupancy rules. But I come back to the bigger picture, which is that housing benefit is up 50% in real terms. It now accounts for £23 billion of public spending. And I have to say to the party opposite, if you come here week after week and you say no to the benefit cap, no to capping housing benefit, no to restricting the growth of benefits, no to the under-occupancy measures we put forward, people will simply not believe you have any plans to deal with our deficit whatsoever. And you know what? They'd be right.
Nadine Dorries.
Mr. Speaker, education reforms as pursued by this government have been embraced by schools in Bedfordshire, not least excitingly by Tony Withel and his great staff at Wotton School in the pursuit of a STEM academy. However, this week there has been a blip. Fernwood School in Woburn Sands, which had been offered free school status 14 months ago, has found that, as part of the Barnfield Trust, has found last week that that has been removed without knowing why. I wonder if the Prime Minister could use his officers to implore the Department of Education to let me know as soon as possible the reason, because I have 110 very agitated parents that I need to help frame an appeal.
Well, first of all, I would join her in strongly supporting the free schools movement. I think it is a remarkable advance that within just 2.5 years we now have 101 free schools that are open. We have many more in the pipeline. I know that my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, was listening very closely to what she said about this specific proposal. It's obviously important that we vet proposals to make sure they are strong proposals for education, that they have parental support, that they'll raise standards in the local area. But I strongly support the free schools movement, and I'm sure that my right honourable friend will be in touch with her.
Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my own local authority have done some pioneering work over the years on improving public health, and they've recently asked adults to refrain from smoking in children's play areas. Does the Prime Minister agree with me, one of his own health ministers, the member for Broxtowe, and my honourable friend, the member for Stockton North, who has a private member's bill on the issue, that we should go a significant step further and introduce a ban on smoking where children are present in vehicles?
Well, I think we should look carefully at what he and others have said. We are looking across the piece at all the issues about whether we should follow the Australians with the ban on packaging, what more we can do on restricting smoking in public places. I think there has been a real health advance from some of the measures that have been taken. We have to look at each one and work out whether there is a real public health benefit, but I think that he makes a good point.
Mr. Stuart Jackson.
It is 22 years since the landmark Medical Research Council report made a direct link between folic acid and the prevention of neural tube defects in childbearing women, such as spina bifida. Scores of countries have fortified their basic foodstuffs, but this policy is mired in bureaucracy in this country between the Food Standards Agency, the Department of Health and others. Will the Prime Minister do everything he can and give a reassurance to the House that he will unblock this logjam to prevent the entirely preventable conditions of hydrocephalus and spina bifida?
Well, I will look very carefully at what my honourable friend has said. It's certainly true that levels of conditions like spina bifida have come down, and it's certainly true that folic acid has got an important role to play. In terms of the specific points he makes and the bureaucratic problem he identifies, I will look at that and perhaps get the Department of Health to write to him about it.
Mr. Tom Clark.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, I make no apology for returning to an issue which my colleagues have raised. A letter from my constituent said this: I am disabled, wheelchair dependent, suffer from brittle bones, require day and night assistance from social services, and therefore I need a spare room on health grounds. I feel suicidal about this bedroom tax. Would the Prime Minister, consulting with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, agree to put the needs of disabled people first and revisit what's turning out for hundreds of thousands of disabled people and their families to be a disastrous policy.
This government always puts disabled people first, and that is why we have protected disabled benefits. Specifically on the issue that he raises, there is the £50 million fund to support people affected by the under-occupancy measure. Disabled adults will have access to... Well, they don't want to hear the answers. This directly answers the point. Disabled adults will have access to discretionary housing payment scheme, and it will remain for local authorities, like his own local authority, to assess the individual circumstances. But it is worth making the point again. A £23 billion budget, 50% increase over the last decade. We have to do something about the growth in the housing benefit bill, and all we hear is irresponsibility from the party opposite.
Mr. Edward Lee.
Who would have thought, when some of us voted for just a common market all those years ago, that the EU would now be interfering potentially in what benefits we should be paying to Romanians and Bulgarians before they have made any contribution to our society? Is it any wonder people feel disillusioned and powerless? But isn't the good news this? That who is more likely to vote to give people a genuine choice in the referendum? A Liberal or a Conservative MP for Eastleigh?
Well, I'm delighted my honourable friend managed to slip that point in at the end. I would urge any honourable friends who aren't there already to make their way to Eastleigh this afternoon and support Maria Hutchins in the by-election campaign. But the point that he makes is very important, which is we need to look through every aspect of how we welcome people to our country and make sure, while we must be fair, we must not be a soft touch. So I'm making sure we look at our health service, we look at housing, we look at benefits, we look at legal aid, we look at all of the things, and make sure we have proper and tough controls on people who want to come and live here.
The Treasury was required to approve the settlement made with the dismissed former Chief Executive of my local hospitals trust in February last year. If he believes in openness in the NHS, why has his government allowed the size of this payoff to be kept secret?
Well, I will look very closely at this issue that he raises. I know there have been particular issues around foundation trusts in the area which he represents, and I will make sure that the Health Secretary looks at and writes to him about this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, large numbers of my constituents have taken a great interest in political campaigning in the neighbouring county. And my belief is that it's always best if local people have a strong, independent voice, particularly if they're in favour of controlling immigration, making welfare fairer, and an in-out referendum. Does the Prime Minister agree with my advice that the people of Eastleigh would be well advised to vote for Maria Hutchins tomorrow?
I want to thank my honourable friend for his hard work and for the ingenious way he managed to get that question in order.
Rhonda, you shouldn't keep yelling from a sedentary position. Sarah Palin. She, at least, is not a candidate in the Eastleigh by-election. The Prime Minister.
If you have any luck in getting the honourable member for Rhonda to shut up, then do let us know how it's done.
Say that the Prime Minister shouldn't bother phoning me. I'll phone him in those circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps we could end Prime Minister's questions on a similar note to that which we began it with recognising the appalling views of the Labour candidate in Eastleigh. He said this about the Falklands War, one of the proudest moments of this country's recent history. I settled, he said, on the convoluted position of wanting Great Britain to lose a war for the good of Great Britain. This candidate, endorsed by the leader of the Labour Party, a shocking lack of patriotism and national pride.
Graham Jones.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has run away from the question as to whether he will personally benefit from the millionaire's tax cut. It's a simple question. When the top rate of tax is cut from 50p to 45p, will he personally benefit?
The top rate of tax under this government will be higher than any year Under his government, that is the change that we're bringing about. When they introduced the 50p, they lost £7 billion in tax revenue. They're not only socialists, they're incompetent socialists to boot.
Order!